I want to continue on with this conversation here on Live Now from Fox and talk with Axios reporter Victoria Knight. Victoria, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. And there were a lot of heated moments yesterday between lawmakers and Fauci talking about the origins of COVID. What were the biggest takeaways in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, like you said, this is the first time Fauci has appeared before Congress since he retired. So I think it was, for a lot of lawmakers, their first chance at asking Fauci questions. And it was the first time, since he left, for the select subcommittee, which was established at the beginning of the 118th Congress about a year and a half ago, to have their chance to ask him questions. And for that reason, I think we heard a lot of same things that we had heard at previous hearings with Fauci on the Hill, where there were a lot of questions from Republicans on the origins of COVID, questions about, COVID policies such as lockdowns, 6 feet social distancing, why children were not allowed in schools. And then also there was some slightly newsier things. The biggest thing, to be honest, was checking if Dr. Fauci had ever used a private email address for government business. That was something that Republicans really wanted to ask him about.
Yeah, it was very, very interesting talking about that, talking about if he profited off of the COVID pandemic as well. Let's get into some of the things you mentioned about social distancing as well as masking. And for the first time since the pandemic, Dr. Fauci really admitted there was no science in determining that 6 feet was the mark. What do we learn there about that?
Well, there's a little bit of context around that statement that he said. He was saying that there were no clinical studies around the 6 foot distancing recommendation. But he did say there were other types of studies that were done that showed, hypothetically, it seems that viral droplets may spread up to a 6 feet distance. So he was saying there were no clinical studies to necessarily support that scientific evidence, but he was saying there was some theories behind it. So it was something that became a little bit controversial during the hearing, but that one statement was not all he said about it.
Yeah, there were a lot of layers to this entire story around COVID and around his conversation because, of course, he was there under both the Trump administration and Biden administration as well. And did we maybe learn more about the origins of it? Because we've heard different departments coming out saying it likely came from kind of that Wuhan lab. Is that growing more and more in the consensus there on Capitol Hill?
I mean, I do think it's certainly one of the areas on the COVID committee where both Republicans and Democrats do say, we're not sure where the origins of COVID are. Even, Dr. Fauci has said that, he's not ruling out the lab leak necessarily. So it is something that, and Democrats have said, hey, we would actually like to do, this is an area we agree on, let's do more work on trying to figure out the origins. So, but to saying all that, we still don't know exactly where COVID came from, but there were a lot more questions about that yesterday as well.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And I feel like sometimes at these House hearings, you don't learn a lot. But this one, it felt like we did. Maybe what's the next step of this process? Will Fauci be before Congress again? Do we expect anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure about that necessarily. I think what will happen next is I know that the COVID committee is probably going to be putting in more records requests, trying to get information, specifically, like I mentioned, the private email addresses. I think they probably want to check and see if Fauci did use a private email address for government business. Yesterday in the hearing, he said, to the best of my knowledge, I did not use a private email address. So I think if they found some records that showed potentially that he did for government business, they would probably bring him back in. I think other than that, the committee is going to keep doing, bringing in government officials, seeing what else they can find through record requests, and they'll release a report by the end of the year when this Congress is over. That will probably include recommendations for, if there's another pandemic, and also reforming certain ways the government responds to pandemics potentially.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about that because that was kind of the overarching kind of theme of it, is not necessarily also looking back at COVID, but also seeing what could be done better the next time around. Do you think maybe the U.S. government, people there, are more prepared if and when a next pandemic rolls around?
I mean, I think there's still some work to be done.
That's a big question, I know.
To be honest, yeah, that's a big question. You know, there's been actually a pandemic preparedness program that has its authorization has relapsed this Congress, and it's because in part Republicans and Democrats can't decide how they want to address certain policy questions such as drug shortages or things like that. So I think there's still a lot that Congress needs to figure out before another pandemic. But I think we do know that the federal government is capable of developing a vaccine very quickly. So that's something that's kind of a lesson learned. And I think it's also probably, you know, some of these COVID policy recommendations that came out that, you know, Republicans have been asking a lot about. I think there probably will be some lessons learned from those too. Maybe, you know, there were certain areas that we didn't need to do what we did before. So I think there's some, but there's also still a lot more that could probably be learned.
Yeah, and there's a lot of context to a lot of these statements about social distancing, about masking as well, and there really wasn't, like you mentioned, a whole lot of time to put the right amount of studies into these, but potentially being more prepared, at least more prepared next time around. All right, Victoria, anything else? Any more thoughts that we're forgetting to touch on that I missed before I let you go?
Yeah, I think one other thing that they did touch on the hearing yesterday was, you know, Dr. Fauci did say the way that he defines gain of function research, which is it's a way to like modify different types of genes and things like that. The federal government never funded that kind of research in China. That's what he testified to yesterday. But I think there's still a lot of questions from both sides, both from Republicans and Democrats, on what U.S. government funds are going to scientific institutions in other countries, and if there needs to be a conversation around changing, you know, where those grants go to, kind of overseeing what kind of research is being done in those scientific labs in other countries. And I think that's another area that both sides may be open to reforming.
Okay. Very, very interesting. All right, Victoria, thank you again. Great reporting, as always, on a very in-demand House hearing yesterday with Dr. Anthony Fauci. We appreciate your time.